Hi there, I'm Alex Hicks, and I'm going to talk to you today about some of the rigging work that I've done, both on point of interest and for, my own portfolio pieces, and also for the future students who may or may not be working with these characters later on. So, sort of as an introduction, recently I worked as the 3D department head for a couple years at a place called the Gaming Animation Institute of Fredericton. One of my main jobs there, or one of my big jobs there, I suppose, was working to teach the rigging course and to improve the course as well. Because at the time it was in the works, I guess. So this involved learning a lot about rigging. And you can see I've got a character rig up here. This is the first character that I built, Dan. So in teaching the rigging course, I recalled my own education, and one of the things that I had disliked about it was that all the students interested in animation were expected to build their own rigs or locate their own rigs. They weren't supplied with rigs to work with. Now the problem with this is people, the very talented animators, would end up working with rigs that didn't work very well, were unstable or unreliable, and as a result deciding they didn't want to be animators after all, when in fact, it is entirely the fault of the rig or the rigger or what have you. And while that taught good generalist skills, making everyone build their own rigs, not everyone's a generalist. Some people just want to be animators, who just want to get in and be able to animate and know that the rig's not going to explode all over the place. And at this point, it would be a point of embarrassment if Dan did in fact explode, but I don't think he's going to. Anyway, so in addition to teaching the rigging course, and at the time I was teaching the rigging and animation courses side by side, so I could teach something in rigging and then demonstrate why that was relevant in animation. That was a neat system, I thought. Actually, at the time, we had a backup teacher for most subjects, except rigging, because everyone hated rigging, except me. So the sick policy for most classes was, okay, Dan can teach animation if I'm not there. But the rigging policy was, don't get sick, Alex. Which was kind of funny. So in doing so, I decided I was going to build a character that I knew would be reliable, that the students could just take and animate and not have to worry about. Now there was some trial and error, because one of the things I learned about rigging is that you cannot trust your animator, okay, even if you're the animator, because the animator will find something to get at and break that they were not supposed to be able to get at and break. So the first rule of rigging I found was just to hide everything from the viewer. So for Dan here, instead of having anything for the animator to dig around through menus like the outliner is, pretty uninformative, instead I built visual controls for everything. Sort of you just pick up and go. So Dan here, well, not everything's labeled in text. Everything is constructed in such a way to indicate is what it does. So these sort of shells that go around his body like a suit of armor, just to hide and unhide the animation controls there. These all work by rotation in FK mode. One of the more frustrating prospects of rigging is when you twist the arm, that twist isn't gradual along the length of the arm. Dan's here is. Just, so the animations can look a little nicer when the students are working with them. Fingers are all individually opposable. All that good stuff. So, there are some floating doohickeys around here, and they're designed to turn different switches on and off. For instance, his feet right now are in IK mode, so I can move his feet around, position his foot, position his knee. I was quite proud of this little arrow doodad that sticks out of the knee FK control, IK control there. Things Unnecessary, Volume 1. On the foot, you have typical heel, toe, ball, individual toe control, that kind of stuff. And that's all right there underneath it. Now, these could have their own visual sliders, but I figured those would be kind of cluttering, and since the animators are going to have to be in here entering values anyway, they might as well get used to working with these. When rigging stuff for my own purposes, I tend to work more with these than I do with this stuff, because this stuff's all kind of time-consuming to set up and make it work. But anyway, with these, the animator can, position the foot walking around, and then add in the toe value, the heel value, toe curl, all that stuff. Now for all the controls, I also locked out everything that you can't actually key in. Okay, so translation, rotation for this one. Just that way, an animator's not going to grab one controller and decide to, you know, translate it over here and, yeah, Alex, my rig is broken, why is this happening? It's, well, it happened because you decided to not read the instructions, I guess. So instead of having instructions for them to read, I just decided to eliminate all things that could possibly go wrong. With, you know, some degree of success, I suppose, but not entirely. So these switches here, this little gingerbread man thing, I guess, control the IKFK switches for everything. So I figured that would be important. So turn them on. Arm goes into IK mode. Now he can move his arm by translating it around, moving his elbow. Okay, so you can have a whole animation in IK mode and then just switch it to FK mode, and instead of just being a toggle, it is a gradient. So you can it'll avoid snapping in the animation, and it's all constructed to avoid flipping. In most cases, anyway. I did a lot of bug testing with that. His spine currently is in FK mode, so it works via rotation. Select all its segments. It's a cumbersome little dance he's doing. It can of course be switched into IK mode, where you just work by translating his upper spine. And his neck as well, to IK mode. And his legs can go into FK mode. So, kick up his legs, rotate them around. Needs to be on all the way. That's why it was floating off its controller there. And when that's all said and done and I have him in whatever pose I want it to be, I can still switch it back to IK mode. And it all works pretty seamlessly. Turn that back to 0 before I forget about it. Okay, so there he is. Now Dan actually has an additional series of controls. Now when I built the model, I wanted it to be sort of the ultimate rig. Because you get a lot of, when you're working with a character, well, the rig can't do that, so you can't have the animation work this way. I didn't want that to happen with Dan. I wanted it to be sort of the ultimate animation rig, which was ambitious, considering I hadn't built rigs of sort of that complexity before. It's one thing to build a rig for yourself to use and then just deal with whatever consequences, have all these band-aid fixes, but when we're building rigs for like a bunch of people to use, suddenly everything matters. Like, it can't have little glitches here and there. They get noticed, they get complained about. It was an amazing practice for working sort of with a team, because students can be extremely demanding, you know, with this extra work that you're not being paid for. So yeah, it was an interesting experience. So you'll notice, or maybe you didn't notice, that when I switch the arm from FK mode into IK mode, this second little toggle appears. Okay, and this toggle is the spline switch. And when you select it, it'll tell you that its name is in fact spline switch. Okay, and when I turn this on, his elbow suddenly ceases to be, and it switches into this mode here. What this lets me do is grab an arm and just pull it, and you can see now he is stretching, whereas the other arm here, just by contrast, has bounds. It is the length of his arm and no longer, and it has an elbow. And instead of an elbow, this arm has a 4-point spline controlling its basic whereabouts. Okay. Now, one of the problems with this spline controller in its early stages is that it had difficulty understanding which way was up, so it still uses the same pull vector from the regular IK arm that would normally control where the elbow is. It just does the exact same thing, so the entire curvature just stays intact and twists. The wrist, when rotated, still serves to rotate the arm as well. So just the twist controllers work as normal. But basically this lets you have him Mr. Fantastic something right across the room and, you know, animate the arm doing strange things. He has finite geometry, so you can see it's getting a little angular. He can be subdivided. Just turn him into regular mode there. Subdivide him. The model holds together pretty well. Initially, Dan could not be subdivided. Well, you could subdivide him, but he didn't look very nice. He was all hard edges, but I replaced them all with bevels, because I had some students who just insisted on, like, not even subdividing, but actually doing a mesh smooth, and having my nice model suddenly look lumpy and strange on their renders, and then my name goes in the credits for it anyway. Ugh. frustrating. Yeah, now he can be subdivided just fine, and that will deal with the finite geometry that you have to work with, at least to some degree. Oh, and these, you'll notice the rotations are not locked out. That is because these can also be rotated to just locally rotate part of the arm and not the rest of it, if ever that was relevant. So, 4-point spline mode is what that does. So while this is stretched across the universe, this switch, right, automatically turns off when you turn off the IK mode, and just puts it back into FK mode. And it'll come back on when we put it back into this mode. Okay. There was something of a problem before, again, bug testing, where students would put it into FK mode and then leave the IK, the spline switch on. Again, a special note to all riggers: do not trust your animator. Your animator is the enemy. He will find a way to break your stuff. Okay, so that's fun with that. So Dan, all of his components can work this way. They all work with this spline controller system. So both of his arms, which you've just seen, his legs can also be switched into spline mode. Now the controls are still there, they're just inside of his leg geometry. So you can have him take a stride off into the distance. And have his leg do this big cartoony step, or something like that. It's another one of those sort of overly ambitious things that I wanted to do was, you know, Dan can make any kind of entrance that he wants. So that also applies to his spine. Now his spine, even in IK mode, has this. The reason being is sometimes rigs will use the typical spine system, and when you pull it up, then he just gets longer, but you know, either the joints can't stretch to compensate, or like there's just a gap all of a sudden. There's lots of annoying ways that it can work. So instead of Dan having a limitation, if the animator wants to bring him off model, he just can. Okay, now ideally he wouldn't just bring it up like this, but it's you know, the animator has the option to bring it off model. And this also works again with a 4-point spline. These two controllers here are more or less optional. They're just if you want to use them, because under the normal circumstances when you move it, as I take him and rotate him, his spine will automatically sort of do that S curve for me. Dan doesn't use the typical IK spline controller. He uses something special that I'll get into in a minute. But he does use that sort of system just to hold together this rig, so it's automated. It's a short version of that. The IK spline system sort of controls the position of these controllers. Turn that back into reference mode. That's annoying. Okay, so that is that. Shoulder controllers don't really do anything but shoulders, but they're worth mentioning. Students forget often that he has shoulders, and that shoulders are an important part of animation. So remember that one, guys. Just put this guy back into normal. Oh, and the neck. The neck also works the same way. So you can just make Giraffe Dan look off into the distance. Okay, so I'll just put him back into more of a neutral pose. 0 is always the neutral pose. Something of an exception being that his feet have a default rotation of 19 point etc. Just because that puts the foot exactly in where the mesh's bind pose is. You can still put the foot at 0, and that'll just make the foot straight. But when you open the scene, it'll have 19.397, and that just puts the mesh in the bind pose. Because otherwise you have, like, when you move the foot forward and back, it's moving at a weird angle. So that was just a preference thing that I decided to do. Okay, now the more fun part of Dan's rig. This is the bit where I usually get some laughs when I'm doing demonstrations for people. This is the face controllers. It's this big, bulky thing. If it's too bulky, you can just make it smaller. It won't actually have any effect on the functionality. And it can be moved around just so you can put it wherever. I could have it like follow the head, but I wanted it to just be free in the scene wherever you wanted it to be. So these little widgets, the boxes, the black boxes are just to indicate the bounding boxes of things. You'll notice that the little square can't move outside that bounding box. And you'll notice that when I move the square around, Dan talks. Blah, 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 blah. Now this is a little laggy for me because Dan is subdivided, so I'm going to unsubdivide Dan. Won't really change the appearance of things here much. Okay, so I can move his jaw. I can move his tongue. Now the tongue system's a little weird. Basically this controls the base of his tongue, this controls the end of his tongue. Base. Tip. This lets you put his tongue into weird positions. It's pretty gross looking, I know. This controls the length of his tongue. Now there's nothing to really stop his tongue from going through his face, so don't do that. But it can, yeah, you can position it more or less however you want. And this was just made for dialogue animation and stuff like that, or animation that involves a tongue. Dan's tongue is much more robust than the rest of the models did. Partly because it was just underused. It wasn't I guess a much appreciated feature, so I didn't spend a lot of time putting it in other models. Anyway. A much appreciated feature is the fangs controller, which just turns the teeth into fangs. And just because I want to geek out about this for a minute, just open his, gonna move his lips out of the way. So I can do that. Okay, when I move the fangs controller, you're gonna see the top set of his teeth slide over by one tooth. So they go from being in line with each other to being interlocking. And that the bottom gums here actually change to compensate. And I was quite pleased with myself that that worked. And you should all be very excited about it. That is all. Okay. Moving on with other things. Lips. Rather indescriptively named. Just determines which of his lips is ahead of the other. Lower lip or upper lip. And it's useful for some facial expressions and some dialogue things. But it's not very exciting. The pucker controller does as it says. Allows you to make Dan pucker up. Wah, 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 wah. Again, for dialogue stuff. The smile and frown, I was actually just updating a little bit earlier to make it more disturbingly big when he grins. Okay, you make him smile and smile and frown is independent left and right. So you can make him do a half grin or a lower grin. And this is actually really handy for taking facial expressions and mixing them up a little. You know, everything can be asymmetrized, which will go a long way to, you know, individualize dialogue or give it a lot of personality that way. Along the same lines, the sneer can be left or right, or up and down. So as you move this around, it actually just controls which part of the lip is being most lifted up on. So using both of them, you can really change how his lips are moving. You can combine that, of course, with like a smile. Right, so his lips are still closed, he's just kind of grinning, and then you can open his jaw a little, and right, so facial expressions like that are hard to come by. So they'll let you really customize that stuff. Just leave that on. What the heck? Okay. Move this down a little farther. Blink, as it would suggest. Makes him blink. Now he actually has these sort of strange geometry eyes that are just floating there. So those eyes just scale down. Eyes controls the direction that he's looking, so it can look side to side, up and down. I was really happy with how this turned out when it was all said and done, because it's you know, it's pretty liberal with the directions that you can look, and it's pretty easy to animate with. Brows works much the same way, left, right, up, down. This is one of those ones that if you put it in one of the very top corners, it starts to turn the mesh inside out because that eyebrow is going ridiculously high. So it does have limitations, but this allows you to really insanely customize your facial expressions to be whatever you want it to be. Okay, so I'm going to cancel these guys out. 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 I'm going to cancel these gu those all back to 0. Stern face Dan. Because these are the actually useful facial expressions. These are the ones that are concerned with dialogue. Okay, so B, turn it up, he makes a B shape. B, B. Okay. E, parts his lips, like so. TH actually puts his whole mouth automatically in the th pose. And D just puts his mouth in the place where he can say duh, or L would also work that way too. One misconception is that this says W, and people are actually using this to go ooh or what or whatever. That's VV, FF, or VV. They're all double letters. Just that's what I went with. So F's and V's, and these are just the key shapes that you can do. Another key shape that's actually important for a dialogue is the pucker shape, because that's for ooh. It won't make sense if I don't turn that off. Let them go ooh. But it's also useful for other things, just general expressions, so it wasn't included up in this row. So with these basic shapes, you can pretty much animate any line of dialogue that you want. So those facial expressions, they actually work on a series of blend shapes that I'll take you through a little bit here. Just pause the recording. So here are the army of Dans that determine how Dan's facial rig works. And you can see in here, I went through and modeled out different facial expressions. And each of these is an individual shape or an individual part of one of those shapes that he can do, including teeth. There's his teeth right here. Which is, you know, all good and exciting. The reason I bring this up is, let's say he is smiling. Okay, you can go through here, locate whatever smile that you want, just smile left and right. And let's say you need to modify it. In this case, I'm going to give him a unicorn horn. Nerp. Nerp. That's never something you'd want to do. But you notice that that is now a part of the shape here. On this one. When he smiles on the right side, he sprouts the unicorn horn now, because of that change that I made. Okay, and if you need to get access to these guys, it's in the outliner, under Dan, under Mesh Objects, under Blend Shape Meshes. Just right there. And they're all labeled accordingly, and they're pretty easy to get at. So just if you need to adjust a facial expression, or if it's not doing something that you want it to do, then that's how you get at it. Now, naturally, you wouldn't want to use this to actually make him sprout a unicorn horn, but you have the option to do so, just by going in through and unhiding those. Just there's a possibility that one of these needs a point adjusted for whatever purposes that you're doing. So that is that. The last thing I want to show you on Dan here is a little bit about how these his stretchy system works to help you troubleshoot any problems that you might have with it. So pause the recording again. Here we have Dan hidden, and you can just see his rig and these little gray objects that are in there. Okay. You'll see a number of floating joints, and most of Dan's rig actually works on joints that aren't connected to each other. Okay, they're just floating in space. These are Dan's deformers. This is what he's actually skinned to. So when I do, when I'm going in IK or FK mode, you see those joints just fall along with these controllers. Okay, what this switch does, when I put it into IK mode so I can see the spline switch, you will see as I move this object around, that gray plane just sort of keeps between his shoulder and his wrist. Okay, and you can see there are a series of locators placed along that. Now, this is not really ever something you're ever going to want to get at and change. It's worth knowing how it works. And you notice that that plane rotates with the pull vector. It pretty much keeps in time with the arm there. And it twists with the wrist, when the wrist twists. Like so. Now, when I actually switch it into spline mode, you'll notice that all these little joints stop from following the control skeleton, which isn't displayed now because it's just joints. It looks like joints do. When I switch that into spline mode, they all switch over and start following the spline instead. Okay, and that's how Dan's skeleton works. I could probably build it with a few less components now, but it's sturdy enough. He basically has two rigs, and his actual deformer skeleton just snaps between them as necessary. Okay, and if I start messing around with different controllers, you will see that those spline things just carry along with it. When his spine is in FK mode, it actually still uses that that NURBS plane. The spine actually doesn't work any differently, it just pretends to work differently. It's just a functional difference. Okay, and that's just how all of those splines work. Okay, so that's pretty much it for the Dan character. For those students who are watching this, to get the scoop on how to use the model, your instructor will be able to put you in touch with me if there's any big problems with it, and any little problems, your instructor will be able to assist you with those.